Father, thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather again, and now to have this time after hearing all of the things that are going on in our church this week and this month, now to turn and look at your word and hear what your servant David has to say to us from the Psalms. Be with us, Lord, in your name. Amen. We do have handouts that have notes on them you can fill in, and in a discussion guide. So if you have a life group that you're in and you want to have discussions, or you want the study notes, if you want to raise your hand, Jay's going to come hand those out. We're working on a better system than just having hands raised and passing, but for right now, that's what we got. So if you want to feel extra self-righteous by taking notes, you can raise your hand, and you get extra bonus points for that. So that was a joke. A lot of you were like, "Oh wow, I didn't know that that's what they believed here at Restore." So here, many of you probably don't know this, and if you were at the Covenant members meeting recently, you do. Restore over the next 6 months is going to celebrate a big anniversary, and that is our 10-year anniversary. That Restore, the first service that Restore ever held was the first Sunday in November 2009. And so we're about a week past that now. So Restore has been in existence, having a public service for over 10 years at this point. We are in our 11th year. So that's a big deal that we didn't want to miss. We don't want to pass that up. And so over the next couple weeks, I'm going to spend some time reflecting on what God has done as we lead up to Thanksgiving. But I really want to reflect on it we'll talk maybe about things that God has done at Restore, but the bigger question that I want us to consider is why it's so important that we reflect on what God has done. And so I'm going to do that by looking at several Psalms, starting today with Psalm chapter 40. So if you have a Bible you want to follow along, you can go there, and I'm going to read it to us. Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. As for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy from me. Your steadfast love and your faithfulness will ever preserve me. For evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head. My heart fails me. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let those be put to shame and disappointed altogether who seek to snatch away my life. Let those be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. Let those be appalled because of their shame who say to me, Aha, aha. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, Great is the Lord. As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. When we get into a psalm, we want to be able to get into the head of the psalmist. We want to get into the author's mind. Most psalms, this one in particular, was written to be sung by the congregation. And so like any good song, when you go to sing it as a group, you really want to put yourself in the position of the person who's writing it. And a good song will get you there. It will put you in the mood of the person writing it, but it's best if you can get into that mood yourself before you even go and read it. And so before we get into kind of the meat of what I want to talk about today, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the position of the worshiper who can actually sing this psalm. I want to think about where our hearts need to be at if we are going to sing this song along with David. And as I was looking over Psalms and I knew what I was going to talk about over the next 2 weeks and then on Thanksgiving Eve, I knew that I was going to look at these Psalms and do some reflecting, and this one really stuck out to me as it relates to our church, I think. But I want to get first into the head of the worshiper. And first, I want us to see the posture of the worshiper. And the posture of the worshiper is patience. When he thinks back on what God has done, he recognizes that in times of deliverance, when God answers his prayer, he doesn't necessarily do it quickly. There's something that happens when you look back on your life and you reflect. You know, there are times where you look back and it feels like it didn't take nearly as long as you thought it would for God to answer your prayer. Like if you look back on some of the things you've prayed for, in the moment, it probably felt like an eternity. But as you look back, it's not really that long when you think about it. And I think part of that is because as you age, periods of time don't feel nearly as long to you, right? Like when you're 10 years feels like an eternity because that's literally your entire life. When you're 40, 10 years feels like a blip on the radar, and you just want to slow it down and you want to put on the brakes. And as you get older, I'd imagine that that's even more so the case. But the key attitude when we look back is that we recognize both that it didn't take as long as we thought it would, and also that God eventually answered our prayer. But the attitude that we needed was one of patience. We need to be patient that God would respond. And so we live in that tension of God maybe didn't answer exactly when we thought he would, or maybe not even in the way that we thought he would, but he didn't leave us hanging either. And so when we reflect on what God has done, it helps us to get into a posture of patience, of being able to wait on God. Secondly, we have to see the perspective of the worshiper. And that's knowing where you've been and knowing where you're going and having a realistic view of it. See, there's a lot of people who get stuck in the golden years, whatever that is for them. They get stuck back in this era or this period of their life where they felt like things were really clicking. As some of you know, because you've witnessed it with your own eyes, I can throw a football about a quarter mile. And so some of you believe that I'm lying, and so you've begun to call me Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite, which if you remember seeing that movie, Uncle Rico was a person whose best years were in high school. He was much later in life, but he looked back at high school as the time when he really peaked. And the only reason he didn't live into his potential is because his coach held him back. Well, maybe our vision or our version of being Uncle Rico isn't nearly that extreme. But there's likely a point in your life where you believe that things were better, or you could easily get stuck into that. And so I love the language that David uses because he gives us two different pictures that we need to be thinking of. The first one is a picture of the pit of destruction. Now, I don't know what a pit of destruction is, but it doesn't sound good. And it sounds like something that someone else puts us into. Like, I think there are times in our life where we feel like we're being constrained by people around us, that we're in this pit of destruction that we can't get out of. But the second version, the second picture he gives is of a miry bog. Have you ever walked through mud that was so thick you couldn't get your feet out of it? Or that it would like suck your shoe right off your foot? That's a miry bog. That's what he's talking about. And so as I thought about that, as I thought about what it's like to be in a miry bog, to be totally weighed down, totally unable to move, just stuck, the reason I love that picture is because I imagine that in the psalmist's mind, he's thinking of a place that he walked. Not somewhere that someone put him, but a place that he got himself into. That he walked into who knows what it was, a forest, a field, and before he knew it, he was stuck in the middle of this mud, unable to move. Now, I don't want to dwell on it, but there are a lot of people, especially when Restore first started 10 years ago, and there's been a lot of these stories over the years of people who were stuck in their church experience. That they were in what they would describe as a miry bog. Their description of going to church wasn't that I was going to church to worship Jesus. It was I was going because I had to. I was going because I was obligated. I was going because I was financially tied into the church. And it was stuck. It felt heavy, not light, as Jesus calls us to. And we can be stuck as individuals. We can be stuck in our sin. We can be stuck in our bad habits. We can be stuck in routines. And they feel heavy on us, like a miry bog. Now, we may not have known that it was a bog. We may not have known we'd get stuck when we walked down these certain paths, but at some point we realized, I'm stuck. And so we have to have a realistic view. Because where the worshiper arrives as he arrives on a solid rock. And so you think about the difference of being lifted out of the pit or walking through a miry bog and then walking on solid rock. What are the ways that God has moved you from being in a pit, stuck in the mud, and raised you up to higher ground? Well, you're only going to see that and know that when you reflect on what God has done. Finally, we have to consider the praise of the worshiper. And the praise of the worshiper ultimately ends up being transformation and rejoicing. I have one of my children, I won't tell you which one, but when they get really sad, or mad, or really any emotion, they go into their room and they tell Alexa to play Sad Song, which is the name of a song, by the way. There is a song called Sad Song. And so she goes in and says, Alexa, play Sad Song, and then this sad song comes on. And she just wants to wallow in her sadness. I just narrowed it down to 50% of my children. What she needs is a new song in her mouth. And this is what the psalmist says happens to us when we reflect on what God has done. And so that's what we need. We need the posture, we need the perspective, we need the praise of the worshiper if we're really going to reflect on what God has done. And this psalm both gets us there, but also requires that we start from that position. We try to put ourselves in the position of the worshiper who reflects back on their life and says, what has God done? And when we do that, what we find is that reflecting on what God has done protects us from at least four things. It protects us from four things. The first thing it protects us from is pride. Here's verse 4-5. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. When you think about how easy it is for pride to sneak into your life, particularly over a period of a decade, it's actually pretty frightening. It happens without you even knowing it. I mean, you become reliant on, there's a difference between being proud of accomplishments or being proud of your children when you go take them to like a parent-teacher conference and you find out how well they're doing. There's a sense of, a pride that you can get there. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is when that sense of pride becomes so extreme in your life that it turns from not just an enjoyment that you receive when something goes well for you, but it turns to a dependency that you have on your own efforts. That you begin to believe that you are better than those around you, that your opinion is always right, that you can always be relied upon, you can always be trusted. And the reason that can sneak in over 10 years is because all of you, are probably in a much different position today than you were 10 years ago. Some of you guys were in high school and college 10 years ago. And now you have, adult jobs. You might be married. You might even have kids. Some of you are making way more money than if you're in your 40s, you're probably making a lot more money. You probably have a bigger, nicer house. You're driving better cars. You're not worried about the same type of financial realities that you were 10 years ago. You're not in the same position. See, 10 years ago, you were praying for God to give you those things. You were praying, God, give me a job. God, help me make some money. God, I need a house or a better house. And so you felt like if this thing you didn't have anything, right? You didn't have anything to rely on. And so you felt like if this thing is going to go anywhere, if anything's going to happen in my life, it's going to require that God intervene. Well, now here you are 10 years later, and all of a sudden you have the house, and you have the money, and you have the car, and you have all these things, and you think to yourself, well, now I'm not as desperate for God to move in my life. Because the comforts and the enjoyments that you have sneak in, and they make you feel like I can probably do this on my own. That being proud of the things that have happened has become pride where you're reliant on yourself. And see, I think, when we think about that for our church 10 years in, I think, the stuff that we were dealing with 10 years ago was complicated. We had no money. It felt like if this is going to go anywhere, it's because God is going to do it. It's going to require some significant heart change, some tricky navigation. And then if something happens with our church, we'll know that it was God. And so here we are 10 years later, and we laugh about those early days. Our annual giving in 2009 was the equivalent of like a month and a half of our annual giving today. I think Chris told me this week there was like somewhere between 80 and 100 children have been born in the last 10 years. There's more. The things we're dealing with are different, but we're not dealing with the same things. Children that were at the church when we started were in middle school. Most of the kids that were there were in middle school at that time. They've now gone off to college. Some of them have graduated and gotten married in our church. And so, the other way that pride can sneak in, and I also don't want us to miss this, and I want to say it, is that sometimes we can think to ourselves, well, because we can look at all the good things that God has done and we become self-reliant, but we can also look at it and go, well, but maybe we thought there'd be more. Maybe we thought the church would be bigger, or maybe we thought God would do more in our lives. And so we can get a little disgruntled with that. That's pride too. When you look at your life and you wish more was happening, and you wonder why God isn't moving more on your behalf, that typically stems from a sense of pride in which you think that you deserve more. Pride and entitlement are close friends. See, pride makes you believe that you deserve more than what you have. Entitlement is what that looks like. And so we need to reflect on what God has done, because pride sneaks in and it creeps in if we don't take the effort to stop and consider, why are we here? Who's the one who's done it? Consider what God has done in your life so that God becomes the focal point and not your own efforts or not what you have done. And it's even more essential to do that when you are in a period of blessing. If things are going well for you, you must stop and reflect on what God has done, or you will believe that it was your own efforts who got you there. You'll believe it was you. And so the psalmist says, I will proclaim and tell of what you've done. Our attitude and our language should continually come back to look at what God has done in my life. Not look what I've done, not look what I've acquired, not look what I have, but look at what God has done. And it'll protect you from pride. Here's the second thing. It protects us from missing the point. Reflecting on God protects us from missing the point. Verses 6 to 10. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in a great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. In the lives of individuals and in the lives of churches, it happens all the time. That over time, as more blessing comes to you, as you do things for a longer period of time, you begin to miss the point of what your life is actually about. When God gave instructions to his people, for example, about how they were to follow him, and he said, here's the offerings and here's the sacrifices that you're going to do. I bet when they first received those things, they felt life-giving. I mean, they were probably hard for them to do, to bring their sacrifices, to do these offerings on a regular basis, but there was a sense in which it was probably life-giving because it reminded them of what God was doing and how God was working on their heart. They knew that those rituals and those sacrifices were intended to point toward what God was doing within them. And so they were made easy because they recognized what these things that they were doing were actually supposed to point to. But I bet it wasn't very long before they became bored. It wasn't very long before they just felt like routine. Things that they were doing because they had to. And if you asked them why they did it, they would say, well, because we've always done it this way. Why do you keep doing your offerings and your sacrifices? Because we have to. Because my parents did it, their grandparents did it, and I did it. We all do it, and we just go and we do this thing. And they forget that what God desires of them is that God's law, the will of God, was actually hidden in their hearts. That God's law was being written inside of them. But see, this is the problem. So often, the things that seemed refreshing to us at first become the very thing that get us stuck. If we want to use some of the language that we've already used, the thing that used to feel like a solid rock becomes our miry bog. Like we used to feel freeing, becomes the thing now that gets us stuck. And so, again, this is how this happens. When you were 10 years ago, maybe in your life, you were praying for God to give you all these things, more money, bigger house, children, maybe a spouse, whatever. And then as you gain those things, they feel like a solid rock to you. But the problem is, after 10 years, those things, instead of becoming the solid rock on which God has given you to stand on, what happens is you begin to focus on those things and miss the point that everything God has given you was actually intended to point you back to Him. And so instead of continuing to pursue God and looking for his blessing, what you instead do is begin to focus on the stuff that you have. Your life, instead of growing the kingdom and reaching after Christ and following God, becomes about just keeping your stuff. It becomes about protection of those things, the things that you don't want to lose. And so you end up completely missing the point. Because you end up focusing on what God has given you rather than the God who has given you the great gifts. Now, don't think that a church that's only 10 years old can't get stuck with an attitude of protectionism. See, it'd be easy to see what happens. You can look around, and you can see what happens when churches decide that it's more important to protect the institution of the church than it is to proclaim the goodness of God. But it's not just the churches you think. I've seen large churches do it. I've seen churches, it's easy to point to churches who are in decline and think, oh, well, the reason they're in decline is because they're just holding on to the institution rather than proclaiming the kingdom. But there's a lot of churches that are full on Sunday morning, and they have a lot of people in a big, beautiful building in a parking lot that's packed, and don't get it twisted. Their main energy goes in from protecting the institution of the local church and not proclaiming the goodness of God. That if you really dug deep and you figured out what the motivation was, you'd find out it's protectionism. I have to keep it to myself. They've begun to miss the point. So how do you make sure that you don't focus on the sacrifice and the burnt offerings, the things that we do, and miss the heart change that God actually requires? You have to reflect on what God has done. You must tell of what God has done. The psalmist says, I have told the glad news of deliverance. I focus on the gospel. I won't hide it. I won't conceal your steadfast love. When we focus on routines and rituals and the way we do things, we end up concealing the love of God from the great congregation that David talks about. We focus on the wrong thing. We miss the point. So David says, I've told the good news to the congregation. One of the things we teach in our covenant membership class is this little rhyme. Limerick. I guess it doesn't rhyme. Might not even be a limerick. Whatever. Methods are many. Principles are few. The methods always change. The principles never do. Don't miss the point and start focusing on the methods. Focus on the principle. Focus on the gospel. Here's the third thing that we'll be protected from. Ourselves. Reflecting on what God has done protects us from ourselves. As for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy from me. Your steadfast love and your faithfulness will ever preserve me. For evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head. My heart fails me. See, I love that David is so authentic, because if he wasn't authentic, we wouldn't be able to read this psalm together. Because if you were being honest, if I said to you, hey, do you think you could stand up now and you could say, like, I delight that the word of God is in my heart? Could you stand up here honestly and be like, I have not concealed your gospel from the people around me? Could you really say that? Or would you be like, boy, I am definitely lying? We couldn't really say that with purity if we stopped at like verse 10, because we'd want to read it, but we couldn't bear it because we know it wouldn't really be true. We might want to say some of those things, but we wouldn't necessarily actually feel them. But then we come to verse 12, and we see this realistic picture of who David actually is. Here's what he says. Evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head. My heart fails me. When is the last time you have admitted to yourself that it's your own iniquities, your sin, or as the dictionary calls it, immoral and grossly unfair behavior? When is the last time that you've admitted that those things were not only so great that you can't number them, but that you're actually blinded to what they are, so you can't even see them? When's the last time you've been able to admit that? I mean, if you really want a somber reflection, think about all the reasons why God should not have blessed you over 10 years. Think about all the ways that you've failed God. Think about what you promised God that you would do when you received all that he had given you. I mean, there are entries in my journal from 10 years ago I'm not going to go read, because I know they probably said stuff that I was like I was like, Lord, when this happens, then I'll, and fill in the blank. And every single one of us will do that. Some of you, we Pray for kids. God, I just want to have children. I'll never take my children for granted. Father, I'll be the perfect husband. I'll be the perfect spouse. Hey, Father, I promise I'm going to give more money to you. I just need to earn a little more. And then our salary doubles. And we're like, when I earn a little more, that's when I'm going to start. How many things have you said? This is except you don't follow through. And so you could take the path of shame and embarrassment and humiliation at those failures. And I think that's our default. Or you can reflect on what God has done and realize that despite your failures and despite the ways that you haven't lived up to your word, the love of God has been so woven throughout your life that he did not allow that sin to be held against you. That he did not allow those iniquities to stop his blessing to you, that God gave you eyes to see when you were blind, and he took your iniquities when they were too numerous to count. God blessed you, and he loved you, even when, and especially when, your heart failed. See, the best way to make sure that you aren't the one to destroy your future is to reflect on what God has done. To reflect and see that God even protects us from ourselves. And then lastly, to reflect on what God has done protects us from the discouragement of our enemies. Verse 13 to 15. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let those be put to shame and disappointed altogether who seek to snatch away my life. Let those be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. Let those be appalled because of their shame who say to me, aha, aha. Now we don't have enemies the way that David did unless, he had a group of soldiers out hunting to kill him. Most of you don't have that currently unless you have a career that I'm not aware of. You don't have literal enemies coming to try to kill you, but there are people all around you who would love nothing more than to pull the rug out from underneath you. Every single one of us probably has people in our lives who would love nothing more than for you to trip and fall, than for you to fail, and for things to not go well for you. People who are looking for a reason for us to mess up. The people who are just waiting to say, aha, see, I knew that there was no way that they were worth the blessing of God. I knew that there was no way that they should have what they have. Aha, I knew it. I've been waiting, and finally I've been proven right. And it's sad that sometimes Christians have that attitude toward one another. We know that culture is increasingly hostile to churches and Christians and looking for Christians to mess up and thankful when they do. But sometimes we do that to ourselves. David's not afraid to pray, don't let them succeed. He says, shame them. Make them feel their shame. Make them feel their disappointment. But he's not out with hostility to get them. What he means is, God, as I reflect on what you've done and the ways you've saved me, I look around and know that there are people who do not believe I deserve this blessing. But Father, make them eat their words. Make them eat their words by continuing to raise me up, by continuing to bless me, by protecting me from myself, protecting me from the discouragement of my enemies, protecting me from pride, protecting me from missing the point. Raise me up so that these fools who are trying to call for my disaster will have to shut their mouths. Let them live in their shame. Let them live in their disappointment. Let them live in the embarrassment of the way that they would treat others. David doesn't pray for God to smite his enemies. He prays instead that God would raise him up, that God would continue to deliver him and help him. He prayed that God would protect him from his enemies by continuing to bless him. And I hope that we continue to pray that as a church. God bless us so that your name is made great, but we can only do it when we are worshiping God with a pure heart. And that's where David ends. Verse 16 to 17. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, great is the Lord. As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, O God. You see, reflecting on what God has done gives us a reason to rejoice. It gives us a reason for this joy that he's calling out of us. When we reflect on God's goodness, we take the position of the worshiper where we end up saying, this has nothing to do with me and everything to do with God. That is what it means to love the salvation of God. Why should God save me? What did I bring to God that he would want me? What clean clothes did I bring before God that he would say, this is someone who should be accepted into my family? The answer is nothing. I am poor and needy. That's how the psalmist closes. I want you to raise me up. I want you to protect me. I want you to be my deliverer, because the only thing I can bring is that I'm poor and I'm needy. But, the psalmist says, but the Lord takes thought for me. See, that's what reflecting on what God has done, that's the place it brings you to, where you go, I didn't bring anything to the table, but God has been thinking of me. See, that is the message of the gospel. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the opportunity that we've had today to see your gospel and your grace woven throughout our service, through the songs that we've been led in today. Lord, through the baptism, I pray, Lord, through your servant David. Be with us, Lord, as we close. I pray this in your name. Amen.